Fandom is an odd thing, and it always has been. And music fans have always been some of the craziest and most obsessed fandoms. In the past, this was mostly just people losing it at concerts and sending the most deranged fan mail to their favourite celebrities and musicians. But then, the internet added a new layer to this. Now not only could you gush about your favourite musicians online, but you could also ship them together. The pop punk scene in particular was the most rife for this, considering a lot of its musicians were conventionally attractive people, and they also played very much into the slightly outsider / early internet user audience. Now shipping fanfics are mostly just silly and harmless, just showing band members falling in love and making out, and while this was kind of creepy in a way, most of it was just teenage girls obsessed with the musicians they liked. But one fanfic is the most infamous among this group, and it features two members of the massively popular pop punk band Panic at the Disco. We're talking about the disturbing story of the infamous Milk Fic.
My milk fic brings all the girls to the net, and they're like, it's making me wet. Damn right, it's making you wet. You spent all your time surfing on the net.
A fanfiction very similar to Agony and Pink, as it was also infamous for its disturbing content and became a staple of the subcategory of shocking things to send your friends back in the day. But what have I told you? The story is not only controversial in the thing regarding this fanfiction, also ran into trouble with the law. Now when discussing the Milk Fic, unlike Agony and Pink, there's not a lot to discuss story-wise, as it pretty much does what it says on the tin. I guess for those not in the know, the story details the sexual escapades of vocalist Brendan Urie with lead guitarist Ryan Ross, as the pair engage in a milk-based enema. And that's where the title of the story comes from. Again, most of the discussed and disturbing part of this fanfiction is the long discussions of the milk enema and the creepy, almost predatory relationship between the two bandmates, which, again, we're going to get into that later, and it's not going to be nice. So when this came out in 2011, both Panic! At the Disco's fanbase and the internet as a whole reacted pretty negatively. But it also became an in-joke with the bandom and fanfiction community. It was one of those things you'd send your mates, or you'd spend all night at a sleepover reading and cringing at. And the thing is, this thing became so popular that Brendan Urie himself ended up mentioning it in a Vine, as well as bringing it up in live streams he used to do. Even Jared Way of My Chemical Romance mentioned the fanfic in a now deleted tweet. Nice to know he enjoyed the prose, because I sure as fuck didn't. Now, Drusilla seemed at first not to pay much attention to the people mocking her, even posting a sequel among other fics that let you know she was clearly not a troll. But as the fanfic picked up steam, she would end up getting extremely frustrated at all the people re-uploading her story elsewhere and attaching negative comments to it. She even made a live journal post where she calls out multiple Tumblr blogs that reposted her story, linking each one. And after Brendan Urie spoke negatively about the fic in a live stream, she would react pretty strongly, disavowing her love for Panic! At the Disco. But after this, Drusilla went pretty much radio silent, and the Milk Fic was just a relic of the weird late 2000s, early 2010s epidemic of disturbing fanfics involving celebrities. But in 2017, the fic would trend again, but this time shocking a whole new generation of kids. And with this, a Tumblr user felt it would be good a time as any to detail and document all the crimes and alleged illegal activity of the original creator of the story. After this post gained traction, the Tumblr user Shaking Bones would post their own story. And this is where it gets very, very dark. Again, if you have any kind of sensitivity regarding topics such as SA and anything bad involving minors, just really, I'll give the trigger warning now that this is really bad. And again, going forward, a lot of the topics discussed are really just vile, honestly. So Shaking Bones would post a story about the horror that they faced and the abuse they faced from Drusilla Way. The user states how they met the author on a website called Mibber, which I don't think exists anymore, or at least I couldn't really find much information on. And apparently back in the day, this website was used by the user themselves to connect with other bandom and fandom users, as it had a big reputation for a lot of fan fiction writers on there. There they met Drusilla when they were only 12 years old. Drusilla was already pretty popular on the website long before writing the Milk Fic. The user details how they and Drusilla almost immediately developed a friendship, with the two talking on the phone regularly about common interests in fandom involving the bands they liked and the ships they like. The user then states how Drusilla then became more dependent on them after her fiancé broke up with her. Now, something the user doesn't state till later in the post is that Drusilla's fiancé was only 16 years old. Now, something that the user doesn't state yet, but we find out later in the post, is that the fiancé that Drusilla had broken up with was 16 years old. So we can already start to see this pattern of behavior when it comes to minors and SA involving them. Clearly, Drusilla is not a good person, and I want to make that very clear now before things get even worse. So the user then details how they, as a 12-year-old, would have to constantly console the then 20-year-old Drusilla, as they feared that if they did not console her, she would end up killing herself. So the user states how when the two would talk on the phone, Drusilla would randomly go quiet for 20 or minutes or so at a time, such a noticeable period that the user found it quite odd. So eventually, in one of their calls, the user would end up questioning her about this. Drusilla would then open up to the user that she was pleasuring herself during those long silences. And then after this, she would then try and instruct the user how to pleasure themselves and how best to do so. Again, bear in mind at this point that Shaking Bones is only 13 years old. Then, with that not being enough, Drusilla would end up forcing the user to pleasure themselves with Drusilla over the phone. And what gets even worse, and again goes back to the sort of content of the fan fiction itself, the Milk Fic, is that while she would do this with the user Shaking Bones, Drusilla would egg Shaking Bones on to roleplay as members of their favourite bands, showing that maybe, the sort of relationship between Ryan and Brendan Urie in the fanfic clearly is not something that comes out of thin air. Now the user then details how at that point in their lives they lived pretty much alone with their very sick grandmother, as their father lived with his girlfriend and was pretty much non-existent in their life since the passing of the user's mother. And Drusilla used this fact that the user was clearly emotionally abused and neglected by their family to take full advantage of them and abuse them even further. Later on, the band Fall Out Boy, which the two shared a mutual love for, as again very popular in that sort of pop punk scene at the time, were having a tour in the user's home state of Texas. And Drusilla would use this shared love of the band and the proximity of the concert to the user to manipulate them even further. By buying tickets to the concert for the both of them and then getting the user to let Drusilla stay at their house during the concert and the sort of surrounding days before and after. The first night Drusilla stayed over, she immediately began forcing herself on the user, kissing the user against her will. She then would get visibly upset after the user pleaded with her to stop. The two would then end up going to the mall, borrowing the user's grandmother's car to drive them. So at this point, Drusilla has literally taken the vehicle of this child's grandmother and used it to drive them to a different location. Again, the creep vibes are just really off the charts with this one. At the mall, Drusilla would start crying and complaining to the user about how she thought they wanted her to kiss them, and how they made Drusilla feel like she'd SA'd them. And again, it's just one of those things of like, the child is not making you feel any way. If you feel that way towards the child, that's you. You're the one putting it on her, Drusilla. Just because you are an absolute freak that finds a child attractive does not mean the child wants to kiss you. Not to mention the abuse of power here. So yeah, Drusilla, you are a nonce, and that's why you feel like you SA'd them, because you did. This led the user, of course, to apologizing to Drusilla, which Drusilla, of course, used this apology and the way that the user supposedly made her feel as a way to manipulating the user into having sex with her. So after Drusilla forced the user to have sex with her, she would then spend the rest of the trip essaying the user. Later on, in the summer of that year, Drusilla wanted to leave her state of Nebraska and ended up convincing the user to convince their grandmother to let Drusilla live with them. Now, even though the grandmother was okay with this, Their father did not want Drusilla to move in, with the father believing that Drusilla was essaying his child, but, he didn't actually do anything about it. So, clearly we got Father the Year material there. And of course, once she moved in, the essay just got worse and worse and more frequent, as she would constantly use the user's insecurities to make them do what she wanted. And the grandmother thought nothing of it. The grandmother clearly just wanted someone to look after the user, as they were all by themselves in that house, and that's what the grandmother thought was going on. But sadly, she did not know what was happening behind the scenes. Eventually, the user's sick grandmother was moved into a hospice, as she has gotten far too ill to stay in the house with just the child looking after her. And their father would end up moving back in and immediately kicked Drusilla out of the house. About a week after Drusilla was kicked out of the house, the user's father tells them that he found out about the essay committed by Drusilla from one of the parents of the user's friends. This would then lead to the abused child, as sadly is common in so many cases of prolonged abuse, to tell their father that the relationship was not abusive and was love. And again, anyone that knows anything about child psychology, and again just the psychology of abuse and grooming, knows that this was all done purposefully by Drusilla. This is what Drusilla wanted to happen. She wanted this child to believe that it was love, because obviously the child's brain is not fully developed and doesn't understand what is happening, so that when obviously it would all come to a head and an adult would find out, then the child would not protest against her. This is a disgusting thing that many groomers and abusers in general do, to essentially make their victim unable to testify against them. So honestly, if anyone here is going to say that because the user admits to saying that they loved her, that means that that's the case, you can just fuck right off, because clearly we know differently. So with this, Drusilla would be arrested and face jail time for 1 count of online solicitation of a minor and 2 counts of essay of a minor. And she was then put on bond for $60,000 total. She would ultimately only end up spending 41 days in the Williamson County Jail in Texas. But as the user states in their post, Drusilla wouldn't ultimately go to trial, as the user wouldn't go and testify against her in court. Since she was a child who was systematically groomed and abused, obviously she wouldn't go into court and face against the abuser who did all of this to her. I mean, anyone wouldn't want to face their abuser in court, let alone a child facing an adult that abused them in the court system, and would clearly have defendants pretty much rally against her and say a bunch of questions and probably try and convince her that she's lying. We know what abuse is like, and we know what the court system is like in regards to SA crimes. They don't take it seriously, and I think especially in a case like this, you know that no child will want to have to deal with the grueling court process, especially with something so horrible happening to them. So with this, Drusilla would escape jail time and go back to the internet, sadly grooming even more minors, as mentioned in the Exposing Drew Tumblr page. 2 years later, she would end up posting the Infamous Milk Fic itself, and after reading this horrible story of abuse that Shaking Bones experienced by Drusilla, it does just make every word of the Milk Fic just get even worse, especially the disgusting kind of abusive relationship that Ryan and Brendan Urie seem to have in the Milk Fic. It really does just give a testimony to the inside of this horrible abuser's mind. But luckily, due to Shaking Bones' personal story and many other personal stories, the word has gone out, and now at least the internet knows that Drusilla is a disgusting person and is an abuser. And pretty much from that, she's ended up fleeing off the internet, and other than a few sort of relics of the past, she doesn't really seem to post anymore. And again, for anyone doubting Shaking Bones' story, we have a mugshot which shows the location as Texas and the location of the criminal from Nebraska, which matches up perfectly with the story that Shaking Bones told on Tumblr. As well as this, Drusilla's DeviantArt shows an image of her that seems to match up very much with the mugshot shown. So, I genuinely do believe that this is Drusilla Way, and again, that the crime committed by her and the Shaking Bones story is 100% true. Sadly, after this information became public knowledge, Drusilla has pretty much tried to scrub all evidence of herself and these sort of interactions from the internet. The only sort of resources now being Reddit posts and the Exposing Drew Tumblr. And again, I'd like to thank the Exposing Drew Tumblr for giving me such information for this video. Like, they had so much accounts on here, first-hand people, and I just really want to thank them for not only posting everyone's stories, but also giving a big highlight to Shaking Bone's story. Drusilla's traces don't disappear completely. She still has two DeviantArts, with the first one clearly matching her mugshots, and it has the last post being from 2006, so it's clearly a much older and forgotten account. We then have this slightly later account, which has many pictures of Ryan Ross from Panic at the Disco, so it clearly is Drusilla. And the images on it not only refer to Panic at the Disco and, you know, the Milk Fic in general, but also the images clearly look exactly like the woman from that mugshot. So clearly this is the Drusilla Way that was arrested for the Shaking Bones crimes. This DeviantArt hasn't been posted to since 2012, so just after the Milk Fic sort of blew up. Her live journal also still exists, with her last fanfic being posted in 2015, which, yeah, it's fucking wild to me. And according to the website, when I delved deeper, it was last updated in 2019. The live journal also shows links to her other websites, although most of these links are dead. There is a Facebook where she last posted in 2023, so I guess she might still be active there, but I guess just lurking, because the whole "you're a horrible monster that committed, you know, the worst crime imaginable" doesn't kind of, you know, just disappear from you. There's also a Twitter account linked, which I don't think is her. She also has a Last FM, where the last 20 songs are It's Time by Imagine Dragons. So, look, you know, like, really? Like, not only are you a disgusting nonce, you also love one of the worst songs ever by one of the worst bands ever. So there's that. Also, looking at that profile picture, that is still clearly the same woman that was arrested in that mugshot. But luckily, with that, ends the story of Drusilla Way, the disgusting predator of the pop-punk bandom era, and one of the worst fanfic writers to exist. And I would just want to say to leave every victim involved in this story alone. And Drusilla, you are an absolutely disgusting monster, and I hope that wherever you are now, you are not hurting any more children, because Jesus Christ. And again, this video was just such an odd turn. I read the Milk Fic in my late teens and thought the whole thing was disgusting, but just a piece from that era, and finding out this story behind it just really was just disgusting. And again, I feel so horrible for everyone involved. And just know, if anyone watching this video is experiencing anything similar, know that there is always help out there, and I've left some UK resources on screen for anybody watching, and there will be some in the description below. So again, if you've suffered anything like this, just remember, there are people out there that do care about you. This was a much more serious topic this week, but I just feel like I want to do a video about another wild fanfiction, and I just found out finding this whole story, and it was just something I just never thought I would find. If you did enjoy the video, and you want to see sort of more similar content similar to this one, I'd recommend you subscribe. And again, you know, I have more videos similar to this that you can find on my channel. So with that, guys, I like to say, Comfy Pongo out, and everybody, I hope you're doing well.